Hi everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to do a quick video about closely related keys that we've seen a little bit that get tonicized, and then later on when we get into larger forms, we're going to be full-on modulations into. So let's get right into it. Go ahead and grab a piece of staff paper out, and what we're going to do, we're going to set something up in the key of G. So write out in your staff paper a treble clef in your G major scale. We're going to talk about closely related keys in the key of G. So I've already started this before we started. Okay. So if we kind of think about each of the triads that are associated with these scale degrees, I kind of ran out of room to write out each of them as triads, but we've done the triads before. So we want to think of closely related keys to the key of G. One easy way for us to consider closely related keys are keys that are within one sharp or one flat of our home tonic key. So let's take a look at each of these triads and consider them as their own home key with the correct corresponding major key, minor key that we would still find in the key of G. So for example, our 2-chord A minor, we're thinking of A minor. We think of the key signature that's associated with A minor, that'd be no sharps, no flats. So we're taking the 1 sharp associated with G major and we're subtracting it. So that follows as a closely related key. We think about our 3-chord B minor. B minor is the relative minor of D major, which is 2 sharps. So that's just adding 1 sharp to our key. That's in our closely related key. Let's take a look at the key of C. It's the same as the key of A minor, so no sharps, no flats. We've just taken 1 sharp for G major and subtracted it. So this one is also in our closely related key. D major is about as closely related as key as you get for a major key. This is going to be 2 sharps, just like B minor, and this is our 5 chord. So this is a really important one. This is one that we'll see a lot of tonicization and modulation to in our examples. Now, lastly, let's check out our 6th chord, which is E minor. That keeps our same key signature. Because remember, E minor, we're talking about our relative minor. In 7, again, we wouldn't really modulate to this one for a few reasons. The main one being it doesn't really kind of have a key. It's a diminished quality chord. And it's a dissonant quality key. So we aren't tonicizing or modulating or moving to this key at all. So of these, the first 6 scale degrees of this key, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and 6, are ones that we would consider closely related keys. And we will see composers modulate to these. Now let's start thinking about the logic behind modulating to these different keys. We will have a lot of these closely related keys as a means to get back to our home tonic key. So we want to think of how do these things modulate, and also we want to think of the overall tonal structure of the music and thinking of things in terms of a larger, expanded out phrase model: tonic, predominant, dominant, and then tonic. That these composers now, seeing as we've introduced secondary dominant and secondary leading tone chords, can now expand and tonicize these parts of the phrase model in a more expanded sort of way that allows them to kind of have more room to work with. You just gonna wash yourself over there? Nah, whatever. Anyways, so let's kind of investigate, using our same key of G, these closely related keys. Now, all of these closely related keys, yes, we will see some tonicization and modulation to them. More often than not, we'll see a lot of tonicization. Remember, the big difference between tonicization and modulation is tonicization is sort of a temporary move into this key. And by and large, it's a way to expand the phrase model in a larger structural sense. Modulation we'll see a little bit later when we're talking about things with multiple sections, like our binary forms, our ternary forms, and in our sonata forms at the end of the course, where we'll see a lot of full-on modulation into keys that have multiple cadences within that new key. And it's not just kind of a stepping stone in a way for us to get back to our tonic key. So let's take a look at a key of G with the closely related keys and think about how it would typically move back to the key of G. I have here, first off, let's talk about the phrase model, just to kind of reacquaint ourselves with the association with the phrase model and the different triads built on the scale degrees. So 1, obviously our tonic. Our 2 chord is a predominant function chord. Our 3 chord, as you may have heard before, is a sort of substitute for our 1 chord that we can use. This one's a little bit tricky. We won't see as much as we'll see the 6 chord used as a substitution for the 1 chord. That we can kind of move into that a little bit more freely. We'll see 3 sometimes, but a lot of times we'll see it move into the relative minor 6. Predominant chord again would be 4. That's our main predominant chord next to 2. 5, of course, being dominant, our big axis here that moves us typically back to 1. And 7, we think of this functionally as being kind of a type of dominant chord, as we've seen with secondary leading tone chords, that this diminished quality chord can be used as a dominant function. So let's get right into how we would move from these closely related keys back to our home key. So set up our G here, and we're going to think of how it would move to these typical closely related keys back to 1. Now, for a major key, the most typical places that are tonicized or moved to would be 5, of course, going to 5. And we've already seen that with the Mozart example. 6, our relative minor. We've seen that quite a bit. And 3, a little less common, but it does move there. So let's go through these and see how they would move typically back to 1. Again, we're going to think of them in terms of their usual motion and along with our new key, tools with secondary dominance, how they would use that 5 to 1 kind of relationship to move back to 1. Typically, it's through sort of a larger sort of sequence of chords. So we'll start with 1, moving to 5. Now this one's really easy. 1 to 5, and 5 would move back to 1. This is a piece of cake. Even though we might see 5 tonicized for a long period of time, this one we don't really need to do a lot of steps to get back to 1. And this is one of the most common tonicizations and modulations in a major key is to move to 5. Makes a lot of sense. Let's move on to 6. If we moved into the relative minor, what the typical kind of larger path would be to get from relative minor back to our tonic. So say we went to E minor, and then we want to think of the 5th relationships here. So A minor would be our next one because we're moving in 5ths. A would move to D, and lo and behold, D back to G. So if we think about it that way, we can see a very clear path using our sort of 5th relationships, which we're going to see a lot of with our secondary dominance. It's really needed for that secondary dominant to work. We would see something like this. 6 to 2 to 5 to 1. And if we wanted to think of these things as having sort of a secondary dominant here, so we think 5 of 2, we could think 5 of 5, and then voila, back to 1. So those are the type of secondary dominants we'd see to kind of move these along and kind of give them a little bit more push moving back to our home key, our tonic of G major. Now let's think of the last one, 3. And this one I would think of as still being a closely related key, but one of the farthest ones away, because following this same sort of path, it gives us one extra step. So we're moving to B, then to E, then to A, then to D, and then back to G. So we could think of these as going 3, 6, 2, 5, 1. Just thinking of this relationship. Now, if we have any jazz players in the room or people who are familiar with playing jazz in sort of a harmonic instrument, we have seen this sort of formula, 3, 6, 2, 5, 1, so many times. And there's so many standards that are built out of this formula as a means of moving back to our tonic, but giving us a little bit more dynamic kind of functional chromaticism for players to improvise on and to add their own changes into. For where we're at right now, we'll typically see a lot of kind of 5 of 6, 5 of 2, 5 of 5, and then back to 1. So this is sort of a larger scope kind of tonicization kind of sequence that would typically get us from our 3 chord back to 1. Now, this is something we want to keep track of, and what could help us out with this is, along with having some scrap paper for when we're dealing with harmonic analysis of music that moves around pretty readily. On that scrap piece of paper, we want to think of the triads. We set this up in the previous video, and I swear by it, having triads with the Roman numerals next to them, kind of as a bank of notes that we can kind of think of collections of harmonies, of notes that inform a harmony, but also thinking of this larger phrase model. As we've seen before with the closely related keys that a major key typically modulates or tonicizes, again, was 5, obviously, 3, and 6. We can think of those 3 and 6 as being kind of substitutions or places where our tonic chord can kind of closely move to without falling into the typical phrase model to move us to dominant. So 3 and 6, we want to think of those as sort of ways to move to dominant. So those 3 keys in a major key, 3, 6, and 5, are the typical ones that we would modulate to, or composers would modulate to kind of animate and to expand out sections and to give a little bit more interest, a little bit more of an idea, and more of a place for them to kind of flesh out more of the concept of the composition that they're working on.